Suburb gentrification sounds promising, but is it? What is it? How do we recognise it? And what do we need to be really, really careful about?
Welcome to Your First Home Buyer Guide, the podcast for first home buyers who want to get it right.
I'm Meighan and that was Veronica. We're both buyer's agents and probably old enough to be your mums. But that's a good thing because between us, we've got over 40 years experience and we are going to share with you bucket loads of stories about avoidable mistakes. Together, we're going to make sure that you get unbiased and real information that you can rely on so you can get where you want to be without missing a step.
Now, we've got loads of great tips for you in this episode, and if you'd like more useful tools, head over to the website homebuyeracademy.com.au. There you'll find free checklists that you can download, a free mini course on how to price a property, and our Where to Buy workshop for only $39. Priceless stuff, really.
Bargain. But before we get into the interesting stuff in this week's episode, here's the boring bit, the disclaimer. You, of course, know that nothing in this podcast is to be taken as personal advice. We always recommend getting the advice of an expert in their field of expertise. Now, we've done our very best to ensure that the content is correct at the time of recording, but things change. So check with the relevant government authority or your advisors to get the most up-to-date information.
Today, we're tackling this thing called gentrification. It affects so many things: property prices, taxes, economic activity. And to help us unravel the topic, we're joined by the property professor, Peter Koulizos. Welcome, Peter. But before we get into you and gentrification, Meighan always does this strange thing by choosing some odd house to have in her background behind her. For those who watch the video, very quickly, Meighan, what is it? Looks like an office block, actually. But
it's not a house this time. I thought since we've got the property professor on, we should have something very academically minded. And This is, do you know where this is, Peter? It's the library in Geelong. So it's the Geelong Library and Heritage Centre. I love it. It's fascinating. It's such an interesting building. There was an old library building there, very boring, and they knocked it down and built this in the same, basically the same footprint as the original building. So very interesting piece of architecture.
It is. My property program is actually in the School of Architecture and Built Environment. So I've certainly been exposed to a lot of architecture stuff whilst I've been here at Adelaide Uni, but that looks magnificent. Next time I'm in Geelong, I'm certainly going to check that out. So that's not part of Deakin University. That's the Geelong Public Library, is it?
Correct. Yeah, Library and Heritage Centre. There you go.
That is beautiful.
For those who
really
are
fascinating. Yeah.
It looks like a slice out of a soccer ball. With sort of concertina windows, and it's very tall, and it does look very interesting. And I have to say, I was surprised to hear it's in Australia, but not so surprised to hear it's in Victoria, because I think they do much more interesting architecture than they do in New South Wales.
And I think they do some of the most interesting architecture in the country. South Australia is very conservative, but Victoria is, especially the last 20 years, has been fantastic, the sort of buildings that they built, the public buildings that they built,
Although we do have the crumple paper bag in Sydney.
What's that?
Oh, you'll have to find that one, Meighan. There's a building, it's one of the universities, it might be UTS.
I know the one, the paper bag, yes, I know. It is UTS.
So there you go. Maybe we're going to give Victoria a run for their money.
Peter, let's get stuck into it. There are so many self-titled property experts out there, but your unique skill is actually combining the theory of property investment with the more practical aspects to educate and help people plan more effectively. Now, Veronica, your first home buyer guide, the first phase, preparation phase, has 3 steps, which is build your support crew, organise your money, and do your planning. Peter, we had David Johnson, your partner at Property Planning Australia, on episode 9. Now, if you haven't listened to episode 9, strongly encourage you, do yourself a favour, go back and review that, because that's a really important part. But today, Peter, we want to pick your brains about gentrification. What is it?
Okay, so gentrification is the process whereby suburbs that were not highly sought after become very much sought after. So it's like ugly ducklings turning into graceful swans. So typically it was suburbs that had maybe a high concentration of light industrial precincts, blue-collar workers, low socioeconomic areas, but they transform. And two of the key ingredients for gentrification to occur is you must have a high concentration of historical buildings, and you need to be very close to the city and or the water. So some classic suburbs that have already gentrified. So Queensland would be the West End. In Sydney, places like Balmain and Paddington. Melbourne, Richmond and St Kilda. The inner west of Melbourne is certainly gentrifying now, just like the inner west of Sydney. So the inner west of Sydney would be suburbs like, say, Enmore and Marrickville. Inner west of Melbourne is Footscray, West Footscray, Yarraville and Seddon, which have almost finished that gentrification process. And in Adelaide, it's places in the past like Norwood and Unley, but right now it's places like Torrensville and Thebarton.
When you talk about, I love that there's two elements: historic buildings and proximity to either the CBD or coast.
Water.
And water. So it could be a river, could be a lake. So because the gentrification process takes time, and we'll get to this, but also with historic buildings, with a house, it's obvious, like a row of terraces in Paddington, you mentioned. You know, they're older homes built in the Victorian era, and obviously there's a certain amount of appeal that happens when they're renovated, et cetera, et cetera. And then you've got apartments that are converted from, say, warehouses, say in Surrey Hills in Sydney. In fact, I bought one last night for a client, converted warehouse. But then you've got places like New Farm and West End in Brizzy, where they're older, they've got historical buildings, but there's been also a massive supply. So you've got to sort of balance up what you're seeing happening with what else is happening in the areas, don't you?
You certainly do. And I don't want to get gentrification confused with urban renewal. So urban renewal is where they knock down the old buildings, or maybe there was nothing there, and they build high-rise apartments, whereas gentrification is upgrading the existing buildings. So, Veronica, this place that you bought in Surrey Hills, do you know how long ago it was sold before you bought it?
Yes, I do. It was, actually, I could pull up the spreadsheet. I think it was roughly 10 years ago. We do a calculation. Do you want the exact numbers? Because I can give them to you.
Well, it is Wednesday morning. I may not be able to do all the numbers in my head, but it'll be interesting, even though Surrey Hills is a great suburb, right? And they bought themselves a historic building or a component of a historic building. The thing that drives capital growth is land, and in particular where it's located. So it'd be interesting to do the comparison. All right, so this place here grew by whatever it was in that period of time.
I'll tell you exactly.
Right.
How's this? I will give you the exact figures. So
we're very much going down the data rabbit hole now.
We're just going straight there.
Data is one component of property decision making. I'm just going to throw that right in there.
We'll get there. Just very quickly, they bought it just over 9 years ago for $850,000. The median growth for two-bedroom apartments in that suburb since then was 87%. And that took the projection, if you just based it on the median, to 1.587. I also do a benchmark against, well, if it could double in value in 10 years, what would that make it? And that would bring it to 1.606. And we did have competition on purchasing that property, and we paid a sliver over 1.6 for it.
Okay. Well, that's not too bad, because from memory, I reckon it has taken Sydney 7.5 years to double in price, but that's house price, right? So maybe over that 9-year period, it's gone up 110, 120%. But the point I'm trying to make is, to get a historic building is fantastic, because we're talking about gentrification.
Yep.
But if that historic building can sit on its own block of land, that's even better. Now, I understand in Sydney it's very hard. Like, to buy a house in Surrey Hills would be it'll be almost impossible for a first-home buyer.
If you could spend that much money on a house in Surrey Hills, it'd be a C-grade asset.
Yeah.
So, but anyway, so we hijacked the conversation.
Sorry about that, Meighan.
Let's get back on topic.
And I think what you...
But really, really good information for everyone who's listening. So different way to analyse it.
And I drink my own Kool-Aid there. You know, I actually do the analysis when we buy property for clients. But the thing that you drew a distinction there, which I thought was really good, was that urban renewal is very different to gentrification. And a lot of people, you hear a lot of property experts, and I put rabbit ears around the word expert, talking about growth areas and, you know, and that's what they tend to be referring to, which is urban renewal.
Peter's shaking his head furiously.
Because Docklands, not watching. Like the Docklands in Melbourne is not gentrification, that's urban renewal.
Yeah.
Port Melbourne down the road is an excellent example of gentrification. People bought in the Docklands, most of them who sold it after it was brand new would have sold it for less than it was worth. But in Port Melbourne, it would be a very different prospect. It's like Sydney. Yeah. What's happened in Darling Harbour and nearby suburbs is not gentrification. That's urban renewal. But places like Erskineville, Newtown, Enmore, Marrickville, that's where gentrification is occurring.
Yeah.
Brisbane's really similar. You mentioned two suburbs, Veronica, that I just want to separate them a little bit. West End, which Peter talked about, but you also mentioned New Farm. I would say that New Farm has had significant gentrification, whereas the neighbouring suburb of Fortitude Valley has had urban renewal. And the main reasons for that is that Fortitude Valley was largely industrial and light industrial, and those buildings have been knocked down and large apartment complexes have been built there. And largely around the older traditional areas. But there are very few character buildings in Fortitude Valley, whereas the neighbouring suburb of New Farm, there's been an awful lot of gentrification there where a lot of the older residents have moved out, some of the lower socioeconomic, some of the lower incomes have moved out, and you've got money coming in and doing significant renovations to existing character buildings and really transforming those. So, Peter, I think that's probably a classic case of the difference with two suburbs of urban renewal versus gentrification.
Yeah, look, we were in Brisbane actually a couple of months ago. I can't remember we went through New Farm, but certainly I reckon in Melbourne, because they're only walking distance from each other, really. The Docklands and Port Melbourne are an excellent example of the difference between the two.
Yeah. And so we wanted you to come and talk to us so that we could really help our listeners to understand that difference, because there's a lot of noise out there in the property space and a lot of opinions, a lot of people making a lot of money, and we want to make sure that, you know, you guys can all think clearly and understand the difference. So, okay, there's two things: the location of the suburb and proximity to the city and or water and historical buildings. What are the other things that we can look for as evidence that an area is gentrifying?
So can I start with the funny bits and then I'll talk about the serious bits?
Please.
Yes, please.
All right. Okay. So I've written an article called The ABC of Gentrification. Because I wrote it a while ago, I'm going to have to read from it. Okay?
So go for
we'll put a link to that in the show notes.
A is for alcohol, B is for bikes, C is for coffee. So if a suburb is full of traditional pubs serving only mass-produced beer like VB and Carlton Draft or 4X in Queensland, Meighan, it's probably not a gentrifying suburb. But if the pub only serves old-fashioned meals such as prawn cocktails and bangers and mash, it's probably not a gentrifying suburb either. If it's full of pokies and big screen TVs with sport, it's probably not a gentrifying suburb. However, if the suburb has pubs and cafes and small bars which only serve craft beer, liqueurs, Aperol spritz, it's probably in a gentrifying suburb. If the pub doesn't have pokies or big screens, but it has live jazz music on a Sunday afternoon, it probably is in a gentrifying suburb. And if the menu has ingredients such as avocado, kale, and quinoa, then you probably are in a gentrifying suburb.
Love it. And coffee.
B is for bikes. If the bikes outside the cafe belong to mammals, which is middle-aged men in lycra, and they're riding brands such as BMC, Colnago, Specialized, or Pinarello, you're probably not in a gentrifying suburb. If each individual's riding gear and bicycle is worth thousands of dollars, you're probably not in a gentrifying suburb. A gentrifying suburb will have different types of cyclists and bikes. Look for vintage bikes with a carry basket. If it's a female rider, she'll be wearing a dress. If it's a male rider, he'll be wearing rolled up jeans and boots. If it's a fixie bike, which means it's only got one gear, you are definitely in a gentrifying suburb.
So you're suggesting that mammals run a long way away from where they live?
Well, we do. Well, I'm one of them. The reason we go for a ride is so we can have a coffee. That's the reason we go for a ride.
So hang on. So we've done the A, we've done the B.
The C is for coffee. So if you go somewhere and they have coconut milk, almond milk, soy milk, oat milk, and they have, a range of organic teas, then you are probably in a gentrifying suburb. And if you are sitting on a wooden box, you are definitely in a gentrifying suburb.
I think they're great markers. Okay, that's the fun bit. What's the serious
bit? All right, now the serious bit. All right, here we go. Here's the paper. Right, here's the paper. Now, so we're looking at demographics here. All right, this is the sort of stuff you can find from the ABS pretty simply. So there are 4 indicators that are early indicators of gentrification. So first home buyers, if you can get into an area that maybe looks staggy now, but is just starting that transformation process, then that allows you to get into a second, bigger and or better home in a better location in the future. So if you want to move, if your first home is not going to be your dream home, and it probably won't be, but you have aspirations to move to a better home, then buying your first home is critical. Because if you buy the wrong first home, you'll probably be there for a very long time.
It's almost like you've done our stepping stone strategy tutorial, Peter.
Yes.
All right. So first one, there's a decrease in the percentage of people aged 18 years and under. So gentrification is a childless process. So it means that now there are not as many kids under 18 as there used to be. In addition, there are more couples without kids. So you'll see couples without children in the ABS stats. There are more couples without kids. But the big one for me is, or there are 2 big ones, the next to the 2 big ones. The big one for me is the percentage of people that lived at a different address 5 years ago.
Oh, yeah.
So it's not like the people that live there suddenly become rich and they fix up their character homes or period style homes and do extensions on them. It's new people coming in. It's generally the older people or the blue collar workers move out and the young white collar professionals move in. All right. So there needs to be a shift in population. And the other very, very interesting stat is there is an increase in the proportion of professional females.
Oh, interesting.
Not just professionals, but
more.
professional females. So when I say an increase, it's an increase above the state average. So if the state average for an increase in female professionals was 2% and your suburb was 5%, that's one indicator. But you need more than one indicator to be sure that you're in the right area.
Yeah.
All right.
Peter, can I unpack that? Because that's a really interesting one and it's not immediately obvious. So why did you find that was an indicator of the process of gentrification? Because I can take some guesses, but I'd rather hear it from the person that did the research.
There's research and then there's analysis. So the research shows that. The analysis tries to determine why. Okay. So single people don't have dependents. So therefore they have more borrowing power. All right. Now, if it was full of single males, probably generally tradies don't earn as much as white collar professionals. But why male professionals didn't figure in the stats, I'm not sure. But typically, because you have richer people moving in, the average income also increases anyway.
Would it also because if the woman is, and this sounds so bloody 1950s, but if the woman is also in a white collar role, then the combined household income is generally a lot higher, and so therefore they can borrow a lot more to A, buy the property, and B, actually renovate it.
Yeah, and look, the other stat, and I'm not sure of this yet because the ABS doesn't collect it, I don't think, but if you have same-sex couples who don't have any dependents, then you have 2 incomes, no dependents, and I've certainly seen that in the suburbs in Adelaide.
The pink dollar.
Yeah, where we have a high proportion of gay couples and property prices go through the roof.
Yeah. In fact, Kent Lardner, who we have, Kent's actually working in his sort of mock serious podcast or property data podcast called Suburb Trolls. Not sure if you've come across it, Peter.
I've heard of it, yeah.
It's a good laugh. And Kent's talking about having the what's he call it? They get the I can't remember. Anyway, it's a gay metric for for price growth, which is all about that. It's all about that. But it comes back down to educated white collar workers,
double
two
income,
incomes, no kids. Doesn't matter whether they're men, women, both.
And look, some of the other very early signs are where the creative class move in. So the artists move into those older buildings because they can't afford anything else. Because really, being an artist is really a hobby rather than a job. So they can't afford much else.
And then you see until things you pass away, and then people want your art.
And then you see things like murals on the electricity poles or some murals on public buildings. There are some other classic signs, and we don't have the time to go through all of them. But if we're looking at the demographics, I've given you the 4. If you look at the research, there's about 20 indicators of gentrification. But I looked specifically for Adelaide, South Australia, where there are others that are more prominent in the UK or Canada or the US. But they're just some. And I know, we had a bit of fun with the ABC, but, like a classic for me is the Wheat Shift Hotel in Theberton. Theberton is 1 kilometre from the CBD of Adelaide. So you've got the CBD, the Parklands, then it's Theberton, right? So the Wheat Shift Hotel in the past used to serve bangers and mash. The hotel up the road used to have topless waitresses on a Thursday night, and it was, beers for $1 or something. But you go to the Wheat Shift Hotel today, the only beer you can buy is craft beer. The pub has its own microbrewery. And so blue-collar workers can't afford to pay $10, $12 for a schooner of beer, craft beer. They want to pay $6 or $7 for a pint of VB or 4X. That's just one indicator, but a solid indicator that the area is transforming.
No, it's a great indicator.
It is actually, when you look retrospectively at some of the suburbs that have been through that process, you can't go, they are some of the primary. Veronica, who's in Sydney, would have seen lots of suburbs, in particular the inner west. Balmain is a classic. Used to be very much working class. High crime rate, certainly not like that now.
No. So when I first was introduced to Balmain, actually, was when I was straight out of school. I went to art college in Balmain, believe it or not. Oh, it's Roselle, but on the peninsula there. And so back in those, that was the creative type phase in the late 80s, right? That was when, it was full of writers and actors and that has absolutely changed because the successful ones managed to stay there and the unsuccessful ones had to move places like Marrickville. Then Marrickville was like down. Everyone turned their nose down at Marrickville. And I think John McGrath was quoted as saying it was a Paddington of the inner west. Well, I tell you, anyone from the inner west went, what? Kidding me? And that was, but it's been accredited to him that basically he set off the gentrification process for Marrickville. Right. But the reality is it was always going to happen. It's just that whole ripple effect of it. And there's a combination in Marrickville actually of that gentrification and urban renewal that you're talking about. It's a very big suburb geographically, but now it's classic. You talk about the craft beer and we call it the hipster effect, right?
Yeah, the hipster effect.
Yeah. How many coffee roasters are there and small distilleries and craft beer being made in a shed. So, absolutely true. You joke about the ABC, but the fact is that that's exactly the evidence. But it takes a lot longer because the thing is with Marrickville, that John McGrath article is some years old now, and it's still in the process of gentrifying. So,
I wrote my first book in 2008. 13 years ago, and so it was the top Australian suburbs, so the best suburbs in Australia to invest in. And in 2018, 10 years later, I went back to see how good or bad my forecasts were. And even though I didn't get, 100%, I would have given myself a HD, high distinction, because it was still a very good result. Like in Sydney, for example, I picked 20 suburbs, and though all 20 suburbs perform better than the average Sydney suburb. So, but I'm not saying that because I'm, promoting the book. I don't think any exist anymore. Oh, you can probably buy it on Amazon, get an e-book or something. But
it's slightly out of date now, though, isn't it?
No, I see. Gentrification takes a long time, you see. So many of those suburbs that I put in there, I would still be encouraging people to invest in. Gentrification takes decades, 20 to 30 years. Like there's a book out there called Top 100 Stocks. I've never read it, but I would imagine that the stocks listed this year would be quite different to the stocks listed last year. But because in terms of gentrification, suburbs take a long time to transform, just because you've started seeing hipsters move in doesn't mean, you've missed the boat. You've still probably got 20 to 25 years of above average growth to enjoy.
This is such a key point, and I think Veronica's nodding. She wants to say the same thing. We do bang on a bit about the fact that you haven't missed the boat just because prices have started to rise and the process has started in an area. This doesn't just happen once. It's not a boom, done, over, find the next hot spot, because we do not like hot spots. These are long-term investment opportunities that are going to you will turn over a property 3-4 times during the gentrification process, with an average hold time of 5 to 7 years. So these properties actually will turn over. And just because you didn't get there when the hipsters started coming and the murals were starting to be painted on the lampposts doesn't mean that cannot continue its process. There's still many properties to be renovated and upgraded, and the older population or the lower income population move out and the higher income move in. So I think that's such an important one for everybody to wrap their heads around when you're using this as one of the many tools in the planning process to think about gentrification. But from your point of view, Peter, how can first-time buyers use information about gentrification to make better decisions?
Okay, so you're going to have to do a bit of research. And as Veronica says, there's a lot of so-called experts out there. And unfortunately, many of them have a hidden agenda. So I just gave you 4 stats to look at. So look at the ABS. And if you look at quick stats, have I got time to take them through the steps? Well, I won't share my screen or anything.
Yeah, please do.
So, ABS. So if we go to the ABS website, Australian Bureau of Statistics, click on across the top is census, and then to the left is find census data, and then the first box is quick stats. So you go to quick stats, and then there's a spot there for you to put in the suburb and also the year. So it goes back to 2001 if you want to see what's happened from 2001 to 2016. Next year we'll have the 2021 data. And then you go, all right, let's look at this suburb. You don't have to go back 15 years. Let's look at this suburb 5 years ago. And then let's look at the stat this time around. Are those indicators evident? Are there less kids in there? More couples without kids? A higher percentage of female professionals? And has there been a big shift of the population? And you compare it to your state average. The quick stats will have what's happened in your suburb, what's happened in your state, what's happened in Australia. And if you want some more, we could, hang on, where are some more? Let me just see. Where's my paper? I mean, there are other overseas stats which I did not test in my paper, but they look at the percentage of people with bachelor degrees, because generally if you have a degree, you earn a higher income. Then I looked at percentage of people with postgraduate degrees. Then you look at percentage of people that own their homes as compared to rent their homes. So there's many different indicators, but if you look at those 4, and if you Google my name in gentrification, you'll probably find some other articles that I've written. And it's not just about the alcohol and the bike and the coffee, but there are other signs.
We'll pop some links in the show notes as well. Okay. I think that it is interesting too, the percentage of owner-occupier versus, I mean, we have run a where to buy tutorial for investors recently, or workshop recently, and we've got the tutorial available on the website. And in that, we go through, one of the things that we look at is CFA scores. So that's a socioeconomic indicator. What's the CF stand for? Australia, I think it's called. And that's all ABS data as well. So there's lots of clues that you're getting that. But I love the fact that you've actually isolated these particular markers to see what's happening. And it's a change, and you're looking at over time. It's not just one snapshot now. It's like this is the changing, because that's what we're trying to look for, is evidence of that change. Love that.
One thing, if I could just point out, Veronica, about the ABS data, it's not just enough to look at it on your computer. And if it's going to be your home, one assumes that you're going to have a look at the suburb itself. But, you could easily have an increase in couples without children if there were 2 or 3 aged care facilities built in the area.
Yes. You've got to watch the spread of ages.
So you need drive around the suburbs, see what's happening.
100%. And this is actually what we tell everybody.
Feet on the ground.
Once you've narrowed it down to your suburbs, go and learn what the locals know about that suburb, because the locals will not buy some properties. They will not buy in some streets, So it's many mistakes are made by those fly in, fly out buyers agents who do all this data, and they might even come up to the right conclusions in terms of location. They also may not. And then they fly in without actually knowing anything about that local stuff. So that's so important. So, Peter, I remember the first time I came across you and your gentrification work was in 2018, and you gave a talk at the REBA conference, I think it was.
I did too. I remember that. Yeah, that was in the days where we could physically go to a conference. Be in the same room.
Be in a room with people. That was phenomenal.
And I haven't seen each other physically for 18 months.
No. And I remember that you were brave enough to go back and say, right, 10 years later, were my predictions correct or not? Now, I do also remember that, predominantly they were correct. And so that's good back testing, because there's a lot of experts out there that are making all these predictions without actually any back testing. But the one... I am reminded that the one area where I would say you failed.
I did. Big F. F.
Was what state was that, Peter?
Perth, Western Australia.
Okay.
I got 5 out of the 20 right. But it reinforced to me something else that I teach, or when I'm talking to investors or people looking to buy property. Location is so important. And if you're looking for capital growth, proximity to the city, all the sea is important. The most important is proximity to the city, because the 5 suburbs that I got right in Perth were all close to the city.
Right. The
other 15 were seaside suburbs, lifestyle suburbs. And when the mining boom finished, so did the growth in those suburbs. So what I say now is close to the city or very close to the sea, which is like Esplanade.
Yeah.
Because there's only one Esplanade. You've got a limited supply.
Scarcity, sir.
But and the other thing it reinforced, and I know this probably may not be popular with first-time buyers because this is probably all you can afford, houses are better than units. In the vast majority of the suburbs, and I picked 107 suburbs, and when I say vast majority, it would be like 90%, houses outperformed units. Because one of the reasons is because houses have a good sized land component.
Yeah.
And it's the land that appreciates in value. But I need to define what a unit is. All right. So units include apartments, which are small dwellings and high-rise buildings, as well as the old 1950s, 60s flats. All right. If you can't afford a house, if you can't afford a house, buy yourself an older style flat or unit. If there's only one thing you remember from my being on this podcast with Meighan and Veronica, you are never, ever, ever going to buy an off-the-plan apartment or a brand new apartment. Never, ever.
We did not prime Peter to say that.
We did not.
That's what we say all the time. And
that
sometimes
is academia at its best there.
There you go.
Coincides with practicality.
One thing I do want to ask, though, Peter, because this gentrification process, it isn't just about cities, is it? Because you've got regional towns.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And so does the same process apply?
Yes, it does. I mean, the town that really comes to mind in South Australia is a little town called Robe. Before I was a lecturer, I was a school teacher, and that was 30 years ago, 35 years, 40 years ago, my God. I lived in Robe to teach. And I mean, I've been going back since then, but probably I haven't been back for 10 years. But Robe used to be a place where farmers would go to buy their goods, right? The surrounding farmers would come and retire, and it was a holiday place. But now it's like the surf coast of Melbourne. Very expensive shops, very expensive restaurants. And it's not like the people in Robe have suddenly become richer, right? It's because richer people go there to holiday. It's like the phenomenon that's happening in Hobart at the moment. It's not because people in Hobart have suddenly had a huge increase in wages and they can spend more money on property, or people in Hobart have different lending criteria to the rest of Australia. It's the richer people from the mainland that are buying in Hobart. So, but to go back to your question, Veronica, it does happen in regional areas. Newcastle is a classic. And there are two suburbs.
Cooks Hill and Merriweather,
Cooks Hill,
perhaps?
I was going to say it's got Hill. Yeah, Hill is one of, there was the word Hill in one of them, and there's one other. I can find out for you, but Cooks Hill is certainly one of them. Yeah. And the whole town, I mean, it used to be focused on, mining, coal mining in particular, but it's got a university there, it's got a hospital there. It has certainly transformed.
It's got beaches.
My undergraduate degree in Newcastle when BHP was still there, so early 90s. And I went back to visit about 10 years ago, and the entire city was a completely different look, feel, and Cooks Hill was a really good one. Merriweather, I think you mentioned, Veronica, also a beachside suburb and near to the city. So there's an awful lot all the way along the ports there where it's been beautiful.
Yeah, what's the name of the wharf? It's not Canary Wharf.
Honeysuckle.
Honeysuckle was new and named after a bird. Honeysuckle, not Canary.
Canary Wharf's London.
It is, which has also improved significantly.
That's a gentrification story, that one.
Certainly is. Certainly is.
So I think this has been such a great chat. We've really, really appreciated you coming on, Peter, and stepping us out of that. We will pop in some of those links for your articles, because this is really, it's just solid stuff. You can't go wrong if you actually approach evidence-based research as opposed to I'm trying to sell you a dream research.
But it's putting the two things together. And I think that's the really important thing, because data on its own is a very, very, very misleading tool to make a decision about property, because there are so many other aspects, the human, the behavioural, the local knowledge, the actual individual property selection. So data in and of itself is just one of the many tools to be used effectively. So, Peter, I really want to ask for everyone that's listening, what are some of the warning signs that you might be going down the wrong path in trying to pursue or find an area that's gentrifying as part of your process?
Right. Don't buy in an area where there's a lot of developers building high-rise apartments, because even though you may not be buying that high-rise apartment, it's actually going to slow down your capital growth. And I mean, you can obviously see that happening, but even if you look at the demographics, if the suburb population went from 3,000 to 6,000, right, it's not like twice as many people moved into the same number of properties. They've built twice as many properties, all right? So you can check it out, demographics, but also by visiting there. And, I mean, I know, look, unfortunately, many people in real estate sales don't have a good reputation. So you've got to ask yourself, this person that is trying to push me to buy this house, do they have a hidden agenda? Maybe they're getting some other commission from the developer. But look, if you can buy a property that has some land component, even if it's a townhouse, or if it's in a block of units, but there's only 10 in the group instead of 110, then you're on the right track. But speak to locals, find people that you trust, listen to. People used to read books in the old days. Now they just listen to podcasts.
Yeah.
Listen to podcasts of people that are not pushing some other agenda. And, I've given you my tips. Go listen to somebody else and see what they say. They might differ. They might be exactly the same. But it's really important that your first home purchase is a good one. Otherwise, you won't be moving up that property ladder.
That's exactly right. Now, Peter, as one final question, what is the one thing that you know now that you wish you knew as a first home buyer?
I should have listened to my father and bought earlier.
Interesting.
Okay.
And you do have a Greek background, I'm guessing, from your surname.
Correct.
And it's very much around owning property, right?
It is, but many new migrants, when they come to Australia, whether they're from Southern Europe, Asia, Africa, or India, Australia really is the land of opportunity. In many places in Southeast Asia, you do not own freehold property. It's leasehold. China, Hong Kong, Singapore, it's all leased from the government. You come to Australia, it's your property.
Unless you buy in Canberra.
Or Mount
True,
Isa.
very
careful. Yes,
very good,
there are
Veronica.
leaseholds in other locations as well.
But I think Canberra has 99-year leasehold.
Yeah.
Explain to me then, Veronica, why are Canberra property prices so high, even though you can't buy a leasehold?
Yeah, well, there you go. There's. I don't know the answer to that.
I know the answer.
Well, good. Tell us.
Because the incomes are so high in Canberra.
Because the government is, what a safe employer.
Yeah, that's right. 2 of my kids work for the federal government, and they both lived in Canberra. So I have a pretty good knowledge of Canberra, despite the fact you're buying leasehold, because people earn so much money. They pay.
I guess what's the real risk? They're going to sort of take it, take up the government's not going to take up their option at the end of 99 years, then kick you out, are they? I think so I think to all intents and purposes, people feel like they're buying land, even though they probably aren't. Well, they aren't, but they're buying the rights to occupy.
Correct.
Anyway, Peter, that's fantastic. Really appreciate your time. And what a great episode.
We'll have a lot
Thank you very much, Meighan and
information.
Veronica. Really enjoyed being on the show. And remember, never, ever buy an off-the-plan apartment.
I love it.
In this episode, we've covered a very small part of our 10-step online course for first-time buyers. If you would like to learn more about the process and how to buy without making a mistake, then head over to our website, www.homebuyeracademy.com.au. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you won't miss an episode. And if you like what you've heard today, please give us an iTunes review. 5 stars would be wonderful. It will help others find us as well.
Thank you for joining us. We hope you found this really useful. And if you have, please share the love with others who you know are in the same boat. We'll be back next week with some more priceless stuff.